So far on this YouTube channel, I've uploaded low-budget music videos of my lo-fi songs and a few selected spoken word teachings. Well, this video will be a little different. I want to draw your attention to one of my other creative outlets. You may or may not be aware that I have written 3 historical novels. Well, in this video, I will introduce you to the first book in my Exegetical Histories series, a novel entitled The Ephesus Scroll. And the good news is, if you like the sound of it, you will be able to obtain an electronic copy for free. The download details will be at the end of the video and in the description below. Well, how did I come to write a historical novel in the first place? There were 2 triggers. Firstly, back in 2004, I was extremely fortunate to visit Ephesus in Turkey. Walking around the ruins of this ancient city was an amazing experience. To think that the Apostle Paul may have walked on the very flagstones I was now walking on. To think that I was sitting in the great amphitheatre that once resounded to the cry, "Artemis of the Ephesians," as the crowd called for Paul to be executed. It really brought home to me the fact that the books of the Bible were written by real people to real people. Well, the second trigger occurred one day as I was teaching a Bible class. We were talking about the book of Revelation, and I think I might have referred to the Left Behind series as a travesty of biblical interpretation. Well, a student put his hand up and said, "Then how can you be teaching in a Christian school?" As far as he was concerned, if you didn't believe in the premillennial dispensational theology that undergirds the Left Behind books, then you couldn't be a Christian. It was at that point that I thought, someone has to write a popular level response to the Left Behind series, one that comes at the text from a different interpretive position, if only to demonstrate that there are other interpretive positions that are held by Bible-believing Christians. After a while, I realised that that someone might be me. Once I had the idea to write a novel, one of the central components was that it would be a disguised commentary of the Book of Revelation, much like the Left Behind series was. Only in my case, the disguised commentary would be G.B. Caird's. G.B. Caird's The Revelation of St. John would have to be my favourite commentary of any book of the Bible. Caird does something entirely unexpected in this commentary. He manages to make sense of a complex and controversial book, and he does it in a surprisingly non-scholarly way. Most commentaries are difficult to read. You only delve into one when you have to. You don't generally sit down with one as part of your reading for relaxation regime. Not so with Caird's little classic. This commentary is very readable, almost conversational in style. You can just read it through from cover to cover like a novel. And, like a novel, the story he brings out from the pages of the Book of Revelation is gripping. Caird comes at the text from the perspective of what did it mean for the people who first read it. More about this shortly. To that end, he places the book firmly within its historical context, sometime during the last decade of the 1st century, at a time when Christians were experiencing increasing persecution from the civil authorities. The other major interpretive tool that Caird brings to the text is an awareness that much of the imagery used in Revelation comes from the Old Testament. Much of the time, we can have a good idea about what is going on in the text by seeing how the author is using stock imagery from various Old Testament prophetic books, but applying them to a new situation. So, in much of my novel, I am paraphrasing Caird to a greater or lesser extent. It is my hope that if you would like to explore this particular way of approaching the Book of Revelation, you will start with Caird's commentary. I don't think you will be disappointed. So when I ask people what they think of the Book of Revelation, I find Christians usually hold to one of 2 views. Either they have quite strongly held opinions about it and how it needs to be read in a usually premillennial dispensational way, or they are completely mystified by it, so they put it into the too hard basket. Either way, most people are scared of the book, either because of what they believe the book teaches about the end times, or because they simply don't know what any of the strange imagery means. Personally, I love the book of Revelation, and I feel that it does have a lot to say to us at this present time, but not in the way that premillennial end times preachers think. I've already mentioned the Left Behind books. Before Left Behind, there was a very influential book that came out in the 70s entitled The Late Great Planet Earth. These books are written from the perspective that the book of Revelation predicts the events that are to occur leading up to the return of Jesus. They claim that the beast with 7 horns is the Antichrist, a term that does not appear in the book of Revelation anywhere, and then they identify this as a contemporary figure. Some premillennialists think this is the Pope, although Obama was a very popular choice there for a while, and it wouldn't surprise me in the least to hear that Biden is the current favourite. Hal Lindsey argued that the giant locusts of Revelation 9 referred to Apache helicopters. And of course, everyone knows the mark of the beast, the number 666, refers to barcodes, right? Well, if any of that is true, how on earth was someone from the 1st century supposed to understand the text? So here's my starting point when it comes to the book of Revelation. It must have made sense to the people who first received it. We do this almost without thinking when we look at the letters of Paul. The Corinthians presumably knew what Paul was talking about when he referred to divisions in the church, eating food offered to idols, and expelling the man who was sleeping with his mother-in-law. In fact, they would have known his name. And they presumably knew what Paul meant when he talked about the baptism for the dead in 1 Corinthians 15, even though we can only make educated guesses. And it's the same with the Gospels. Even though they were probably written for a wider audience than one specific church, they were written with a particular group of people in mind. Matthew's Gospel looks like it was written for Jewish Christians, and Luke's Gospel for Gentile Christians, for example. But whatever the audience, those original hearers or readers would have understood it. They were at the same time and culture of the writers of those documents. So what makes us think the book of Revelation is any different? So, who was it that first received the book of Revelation? Well, the answer to that is given quite explicitly in the first 3 chapters of the book. In chapter 1, the writer says, from John, to the 7 churches in the province of Asia. Now, the province of Asia was part of what we today call Turkey. And the 7 churches, named in chapters 2 and 3, are all located in the western part of Turkey. It's quite likely that John, the author of the book, asked someone to take this book to those 7 churches, and it would have been read out in each church. But if the futurist interpretation of Revelation were intended by God, then those Christians living at the end of the 1st century would not have had a hope of understanding what the book was describing. It would have been totally meaningless to them. And, to be honest, that makes God out to be really mean, to give those people a book that they couldn't possibly understand. But God is not mean. He speaks to people in their particular circumstances. Consequently, my starting assumption is that the original readers would have understood the book of Revelation. More than that, I believe that Revelation was written for them. So, how should we approach the book of Revelation? Well, we need to ask 2 questions. What did the book of Revelation mean to those who first heard it? And then, what does it mean for us today? And we cannot even ask that second question until we have answered the first question to the best of our ability. So what about all that weird and wonderful imagery? Can we know what Christians living in Asia Minor at the end of the 1st century would have made of it all? Would it have made sense to them? Well, we know from historical records that there was persecution directed at Christians in this very region during the last decade of the 1st century. That persecution came upon anyone who refused to participate in the worship of the Roman emperors. In fact, each of these cities fought each other for the honour of building temples to worship the Roman emperors. For example, Ephesus won the right to build a temple in honour of the current emperor Domitian. But all of these cities had temples dedicated to the worship of various Roman emperors, in addition to the regular Greco-Roman deities. And there was no religious freedom. You had to be a part of temple activities. If you were a businessman, you would conduct your business at a temple. If you were part of a guild, then the regular guild feasts would have been held at a temple. Jews were the only exception. They had been granted special exemption. But if you were a Christian, what were your options? Either you could refuse to participate and run the risk of persecution, or you could compromise your faith and participate in temple activities. But as we know from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, to do so is to participate with demons. And so Paul is explicit about this. Don't go to pagan temples. But if you didn't, then you would have faced persecution. Now, if we keep this historical context in mind as we read Revelation, a lot of the difficult imagery starts to make a lot of sense. For example, the beast from the sea in Revelation 13 would be interpreted as the Roman Empire. The beast from the earth, who exercises all the authority of the first beast and makes people worship the first beast, that would be interpreted as the local authorities of Asia Minor forcing people to worship the Roman emperors. So it really isn't a stretch to think that the people of this time living in those very circumstances would have connected the dots easily. In other words, it would have made complete sense to them. To illustrate this, I'm going to read an excerpt from the Ephesus Scroll. The novel has two timelines. Half the book is set in the 1st century in Asia Minor, the other half is set in the 21st century in Russia. And to keep things interesting, the action jumps back and forth between the two timelines. But why have two timelines? Well, it's so that I can demonstrate answers to those two questions. What did the book of Revelation mean to those who first heard it? And then, secondarily, what does it mean for us today? The main character of the 1st century timeline is Lucas, a young man whose family are traders living in Ephesus. His church sends him to Patmos, where he meets with John, a prisoner on the island, who gives him a scroll. John asks Lucas to read the scroll in 7 specific churches in the province of Asia Minor, starting with Ephesus. So Lucas returns to Ephesus and he reads the scroll of the church there. Then he sets out with 2 friends to read the scroll in the other 6 churches. But the journey is not without difficulty, especially once the Roman authorities discover what he's up to. We pick up the story when Lucas and his friends have made it to the 3rd city, a place called Pergamum. The city of Pergamum had 2 parts to it. Most of the population lived on a flat area in the shadow of a large hill. On the large hill, though, were all the important buildings. Okay, here's the excerpt. So it was that later that very night, Lucas stood up in front of the assembly and read from the scroll. Things were going well until he got to the section addressed specifically to them. To the angel of the church in Pergamum write, "These are the words of him who has the sharp, double-edged sword. I know where you live, where Satan has his throne." Almost as a group, everyone's eyes drifted in the direction of the Altar of Zeus. Lucas thought back to their approach to the city earlier that day. From quite a distance away, the Acropolis of Pergamum could be seen, the pillars of the various temples standing out white against the brown of the rocky hillside and the blue of the sky. The smoke, too, had also been visible from a distance, rising up from the various sacrificial altars of the many deities worshipped by the people of Pergamum. As they had got closer, they had been able to distinguish the 4 terraces, each one cut into the side of the hill. The largest theatre in the world, with 80 rows of seats capable of sitting 10,000 men, took up a significant part of the 1st terrace, with an agora on the left. Higher up the hill, on the 3rd terrace, they'd been able to see the temple dedicated to Athena. The 4th terrace had been harder to make out, the palaces located there hidden somewhat by the curve of the hillside. But the second terrace had been the one that really stood out. Standing to the right of the theatre, the Altar of Zeus was an imposing structure located at the crest of the ridge looking down on the valley below. With its majestic columns, 14 metres tall, it dominated the entire Acropolis, and it even looked like a throne. The altar was located within a colonnade that made up 3 sides of a square, the 4th side remaining open towards the valley. It was not at all hard to picture Satan seated on this throne, feasting on the blood and smoke and sexual immorality that made up the cultic rituals. "Yet you remain true to my name," continued Lucas. "You did not renounce your faith in me, even in the days of Antipas, my faithful witness, who was put to death in your city, where Satan lives." This time, all eyes swiveled to focus on Antipas's widow, whose eyes were shining with tears and righteousness, both at the same time. Lucas took a deep breath. Even someone who had not heard the scroll before could sense the rapidly approaching but. "Nevertheless, I have a few things against you." There was an immediate susurration of anxious whispering. "You have people there who hold to the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin by eating food sacrificed to idols and by committing sexual immorality." This brought looks of bewilderment to the faces of many in the church. Balaam? There was no one of that name teaching in the church. However, a few, those who were more familiar with the Jewish scriptures and who could link it to the reference to food sacrificed to idols, knew where the finger was pointing. To make it abundantly clear to everyone, Lucas continued reading. "Likewise, you also have those who hold to the teaching of the Nicolaitans." There was an immediate sensation. Several people jumped up indignantly and started talking loudly, so Lucas had to raise his voice to continue. "Repent, therefore, otherwise I will soon come to you, and will fight against them with the sword of my mouth." That was as far as he could get. "How dare you criticize us?" someone shouted from the side of the room. "But idols are nothing," someone else shouted. "So the great teacher Paul wrote." "He also said, 'Do not participate with demons,'" someone else retorted. Brothers! The leader of the church, a man by the name of Silas, was attempting to restore order. "We are here to listen to this letter from John himself. Have you so quickly forgotten his love for us? If he writes this, then it must be for our own good." "What does he know?" The man who had called out from the side of the room stepped forward. His name, Lucas learned afterwards, was Rufus. "John has never been a member of a guild, so he has no idea of the pressure we have been under. Nicolaus showed us the way through." Rufus turned around and faced the people. "We all know that Zeus is not a real god. What does it matter if we eat meat that was offered on his altar?" There were some cheers at this, but also quite a few shaking of heads. And the emperor," continued Rufus a lot quieter, as if he did not wish to be overheard, "we know he's only a man. How can it possibly matter if we just go along with the crowd and say with our lips that he is a god? No one really believes he is. And if it means we are able to continue living and working—" "No!" shouted Hermas. There was a stunned silence, and all eyes turned to face him, including Lucas, who was wondering what his friend wanted to say. Hermas was immediately embarrassed, for he had not meant to speak aloud. He had just wanted Lucas to continue reading the rest of the scroll, for as they had discussed together on the road, the answer was in there. "No," he said, again, this time more quietly. "There is another way through. Yes, there will be persecutions. There have been in the past," here he glanced at Antipas's widow, "and undoubtedly there will be more to come. I for one know this only too well, since I am a member of the Guild of Weavers. I know what it will mean for me if I do not participate in their feasts. But compromising our faith is not the answer. The answer is, well, it's in this scroll if you will only listen to it." There was a long silence. Lucas gazed with pride at his friend, who had clearly absorbed the contents of the scroll and was prepared to live it out, despite knowing what it would cost him. Then, taking up the scroll, he made as if to start reading again. Suddenly, Rufus started walking through the crowd to the door at the rear of the room. Many of his fellow Nicolaitans were quick to follow. There was a deep irony, though, as Lucas continued reading from where he had left off. "He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches." As the last of the dissenters departed, Lucas looked around at those who remained and smiled at them warmly. To him who overcomes, I will give him some of the hidden manna. I will also give him a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to him who receives it." Lucas knew that the people gathered in that small room would soon be living in fear of what Rome would do to them should they obey what Jesus, through his prophet John, was asking them to do. And he knew that they would be asking themselves, was potential martyrdom worth such rewards? But what rewards? Instead of the polluted idol meat, Jesus was offering them manna from heaven. And the white stone was an engraved invitation to the messianic banquet. Yet there was more to it than mere rewards. John was trying to tell them something more, something about the effect those martyrdoms would have on their very persecutors. Lucas kept reading. Now, there's more to the historical context that comes up in that excerpt, and there's more material in my novel that deals with all the tricky imagery too. But my point is, the book of Revelation really does fit into that historical context. And those Christians suffering persecution that was about to get a lot worse, they would have understood the imagery. And they would have realized what God was telling them to do. Remain faithful to him, don't compromise and participate in the worship of false gods. And the book of Revelation also contains an amazing promise to people suffering persecution. But I've gone long enough, so you'll have to read the novel to find out about that. Have I piqued your interest? If you would like to download a free electronic copy, look me up on Smashwords. Smashwords has formats to suit all devices, including Kindles. You should be able to look me up directly on your e-reading device as well, although I can't promise a free copy that way. For those of you who would prefer a physical copy, if you're in Australia, you can get one from Koorong Bookshop, and if you live elsewhere, you can get one printed through Amazon. Finally, if you've read the novel, please leave a comment below letting me know what you thought. Thanks.